Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, welcome to Meet the Author. Today we're going to be talking to Russell Dunn and his wife, Barbara Delaney. They're local authors. They write guidebooks for hiking and waterfalls. Adirondack Waterfall Guide, the Catskill Region Waterfall Guide, the Hudson Valley Waterfall Guide, and another book we're going to talk about, Trails with Tales, History Hikes. So welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting us.
Now, before we start talking about the books, we're going to, if you give us a little brief bio of yourself, tell us like what you do. I know you're not full-time hikers, but tell us what you do for a living, and then we'll start from there. And then,
well, for most of my adult life, I worked as a medical social worker and was most recently employed for about 25 years at the Visiting Nurses in Schenectady. And I've always been drawn to meaning. I always felt that social work was existentially justifiable. You know, I could justify my existence. But about 5 or 6 years ago, I started working at the same time writing books. So I had two parallel things going. So I've switched from the meaning of working with people to the meaning that's involved in writing books. And then about a year ago, I bailed out of working for the Visiting Nurses. So now I'm writing and exploring and just having fun.
okay,
And that's a full-time enterprise.
You've always been a hiker of our area for...
Yes,
okay.
mountains, caves, and then in the middle, waterfalls.
Okay, and then Barbara, what?
Well, I worked as a health administrator, and now I'm a writer with Russell and a licensed hiking guide. And I think what we really enjoy doing is guiding people either out actually on the trail as licensed hiking guides. We work for inns in Vermont and New York State mostly. And
you take people out?
We take them out. And, you know, New York State licenses us to do such a thing. But also, it's fun knowing that people read the books and go out and on their own with these books. We think they're written in a way that entice people to want to go see these particular, especially, say, Trails with Tales, which I co-authored, that, you know, they really want to find out more about, say, Olana or Lindenwald or Saratoga Battlefield, and they like to go out. And I think what we find, both of us, that one of the most gratifying things will be at a book signing, and someone will come up to us and go, I have that book. I especially like this particular hike. And you think, wow, somebody's actually reading it.
Well, speaking of that, I was telling Russ, when I knew you guys were coming here, I looked up, our library has all your books, and I went to the shelves to get them all 4 of them, and they were all checked out. So they're obviously popular. And you actually have a new book out, which I don't have here. It's called the Mohawk Region Waterfall Guide, and I was going to bring that up here today, but that was checked out. So we'll talk about these books first. Adirondack Waterfall Guide, Catskill Region Waterfall Guide, Hudson Valley Waterfall Guide, and like I mentioned, you have a new book, the Mohawk Region Waterfall Guide. So I sense a theme here. Why waterfall? Specifically, waterfall guide.
I see myself as a popularizer of waterfalls, but I can't quite tell you that eureka moment when suddenly I realized this is what I was going to be doing and may be best remembered for when I'm long gone. I have this fantasy of maybe 100 years from now, somebody pulling my book off of a library shelf. You see, there's the connection with libraries. And that's a real good feeling. It's, once again, this existential feeling that a part of me has lived on. But as to when it became a mission, I can't tell you exactly, but I think it was probably back in the mid-90s. We were going out and doing, exploring mountains, and I was doing a lot of writing about the Great Sacandaga Lake at that time, but we were also getting out to some interesting waterfalls. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to write about that as a subject? And nobody really had done anything in New York State. Now, while I was embarking on this enterprise, some books, Waterfalls of the White Mountains in New Hampshire was written, then a book on waterfalls of central and western New York State was written, but nobody had quite filled this niche yet. So I saw that as my opportunity, and in a way it prevents anybody else from writing these books now because I have filled that niche. Those 4 books represent the really totality of waterfalls of eastern New York State.
But you
And
were
I-
attracted.
Oh.
What were you going to
I'm
say?
sorry. I was going to, I think you forgot to mention, one of the reasons we started looking for waterfalls is that Russell also collects postcards, and we would see a postcard from, say, 1890, and it would show this beautiful waterfall, sometimes with people in Victorian clothes, and we go, gee, I wonder if that is still there. And we would go to these little towns in New York State, and we go, we have this postcard, and it says, whatever it says, Warsaw, New York, say, and sometimes people say, oh yeah, other times they say, no, I don't think I ever saw that. But we would find often these, sometimes they'd been industrialized, and you can get more to talking about industrialization of waterfalls, but you know, they didn't look anything like they used to look, or sometimes they'd been totally obliterated, but that was a very fun puzzle for us to go out and find something, and sometimes be way deep in the woods and we'd find it. But
Well, in the books, several of these postcards are reproduced, so if people come in, they'll see these.
But you know what most people reading the books don't realize is that all of those are postcard reproductions, all going back to the 1910s, 1900s, 1920s. So I've intentionally included postcards. We love to take pictures. In fact, we like taking stereographic pictures as well. But I thought, since I'm focusing so much on history in these books, why not include these antique postcards to give people a sense as to how the waterfall looked 100 years ago? They can then compare what's in the book with how it looks today.
Well, you do get a sense from some of these pictures that were used for industry. A lot of these pictures have like factories and mills, and of course they're not there anymore, or just there's ruins. But now you talk about in the beginning of each of these books how each waterfall sort of has a personality. I mean, in a way, they're all different. I'd assume, but you use the word, I think, in all 3 of them, the personality of this waterfall through the seasons. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, each waterfall even has, well, its own personality, and it survives through the season, but it certainly is modified. And in the springtime, when we're out hiking, you have X-ray vision. You can look right through the woods. They're skeletal because there are no leaves on the trees. And you can often see the waterfall looming in the distance, this gleam of white. And then you're drawn to it because of this battle roar noise, this bellowing sound. These waterfalls are absolutely mighty and tremendous in volume during the springtime. That's the springtime personality. And you know, if you were to walk right into one of these waterfalls that are crashing down, it's going to annihilate you. So they're very powerful and dynamic. Well, then we switch to the personality of the summer. The waterfalls become very docile and very quiet. Many of them just babbling streams going down ledges and down cascades, a whole different feeling to it. There are more entities of rock and of moss, and there's a lot of green that you see.
they're more inviting too.
Yes, and definitely more inviting because you see lots of people hanging around by the bottom, and maybe they're reposed on rock ledges and slabs, and some of them are swimming. Hopefully, and I do mention this a lot, there's a lot of lethality associated with waterfalls. I do get nervous when I see people diving or jumping off rock ledges down the waterfall or into the pool at the base.
Especially Split Rock and Bashfish.
We could talk about those later. Some of these waterfalls have tremendous histories. And then in the fall, the waterfalls turn into peacocks. Their personality once again changes, and you have the glorious colors of autumn. And you also don't have the insects, the biting insects. So in some ways,
well, you
they're
write
very
in here.
attractive.
You write in one of them. Waterfalls are both sort of destructive and healing. And what I wanted to ask you about this theory. I guess it's a theory about what the negative ions. Tell us about. I found that really interesting. I know it's only a theory, but how being near waterfalls somehow makes you feel good. What's that theory?
It may be a psychological thing. I don't know if it's scientifically proven, although you hear it espoused a lot. And in fact, I had one of those ionizers in my home once to produce these negative ions to make you feel better. I don't think I ever felt better.
But I think just being being in nature, maybe. maybe
It's
that's
exhilarating, I think, when you're by this waterfall.
Yeah.
It's splashing up, and there's all this spray, and you just get good vibes. But whether it's because the air is a bit ionized, I don't really know. But it's an interesting theory.
And it was the same theory that you were, in one of these you mentioned, why being in a thunderstorm can make you feel good. Somehow with this. So
Nature,
are there any
just,
are there
I
any
mean-
scientists working on this? On this?
Oh, there must be.
I mean, yes, I do. What if you've ever been in Niagara Falls, when you're there, you do feel good. I mean, there is something about being
Well,
out in.
the Victorians referred to it as the sublime and awesome. That's what attracted
Yeah.
them to nature. And believe me, waterfalls were certainly a main part of that attraction. They were drawn to waterfalls. And we can talk later about some of those waterfalls in the Catskills. And
They were some of the most popular 19th century paintings of the Hudson River School, Thomas Cole and Asher Durand. Some of their more popular paintings were of waterfalls,
Oh, yeah.
just for that very reason that the people of that day, if they couldn't, well, they sought out these waterfalls, but they enjoyed also hanging paintings of nature portrayed in this rather romantic, picturesque way.
Well, I think in the Catskill book, it's in the introduction somewhere. You were saying waterfalls, they soothe our bodies as well as our spirits, and they call to our emotions: peace, freedom, happiness, eternity, calm, solitude, energy, power, and reflection. So
you've
it has to
captured
be,
that,
I know.
yes.
And why don't you tell us? The books are all set up pretty similarly. They have each waterfall. You have the description, the location, the directions, and in each one, which is very interesting, is a little history of that fall and that area. And just tell us, they're all very similar. Tell us about the history part, because that's the part that I found most interesting.
For me, it's been an evolutionary process. In the Adirondack Waterfall Guide, I didn't have as much on history, and perhaps I shortchanged the waterfalls in that respect, although there is history. But I found as I went from that book to the next one, and then the next one, every time that I went out, I started thinking more and more about history. So there's a gradual evolution in the books. When you get to the Hudson Valley Waterfall Guide and the Mohawk Region Waterfall Guide, it really tells the story of that particular region through its waterfalls.
Yeah, I noticed the Hudson Valley one is a little longer. The history parts are longer in this one.
Definitely more intensive.
And I would have to say, from looking at these books, maybe you can talk about this in Barbara too, the bibliographies and the notes are really, really amazing. I mean, these aren't just a little hike in there. You can read the notes to every waterfall. It's almost like a little lesson in local history. So you did a lot of research, a lot of
Yeah.
writing.
Well, yeah, I think because, speaking of, in the case of waterfalls, they often were the nucleus of a community, because a waterfall could, first off, if you hear a waterfall, even Native Americans would know then, well, there's a good source of water, and would do their farming and planting around, the base of waterfalls, because they had water to sustain, because actually you need water to sustain life. But as people came over from the Europeans, the waterfalls ran the mills, and so you had settlements. So you have history because, well, you have people, and so you have the culture around the waterfall and the history. And I think that was why we began to realize, besides looking and going, oh, look at this beautiful waterfall, we began to see, well, not only was it a beautiful waterfall, but maybe we saw an old stone wall somewhere, and we said, well, gee, I wonder what that was. And that's kind of how we almost backed into it. You'd say, oh, gee, well, let's go to their library or the Historical Association. What is that, by the waterfall? And sure enough, we'd often find it was a sawmill, and then you'd find out all the stuff that had happened in the 1800s and 1900s around the waterfall. So, I mean, they are really rich with history. So.
Oh, yeah.
If I could just add to that. It always bothered me reading other guidebooks that the author would almost be the one to discover the waterfall. It's like nobody had ever been there before. There was always that sense that this was like the first time. And I really valued the writings of all these other people who had been there ahead of me, and these photographers and the stereographers and the illustrators and all these people who were explorers before myself. Well, so I felt that they needed to be acknowledged because they had a lot of worthwhile things to say. And so a lot of those are what you see reflected in the endnotes, this attempt to give this really historical perspective, to give a sense that history really is a building process, one thing built upon the next. I'm there because of all these people that were there before me.
Like I say, you can see that in a lot of the notes you have references to old books, to newspaper articles, to all kinds. I mean, obviously they're written so people can go look them up themselves. So at their
Absolutely,
the
that
library
they can
or
go right back
historical.
to the sources.
Now,
Which means that obviously Barbara and I have spent a fair amount of time in libraries
That's
too. We
excellent.
love
So
libraries.
We do.
love the feel of holding a book. And it isn't quite the same looking at a piece of text on a screen.
well, these books are made to bring out on the trail with you.
I'm glad you said that, because you're absolutely right. It was the publisher who said, let's make it this particular size so it can be slipped easily into a backpack.
Now, how many falls are in each book? I didn't really count them. Each one has.
Well, the Hudson Valley one has 100.
Okay.
That one probably has close to 80, and that you've got in your hand. And the Catskill region, probably about the same, close
And
to
then
80.
your new one, the Mohawk region. How many is
That's probably close to 100.
Okay. So these are at local bookstores, and like I say, anyone who likes waterfalls, they're very accessible. It gives you the description, how to get there. But before we move on to the other book, I did have to ask you one question, because in all these 3 books, there's I think 2 or 3 or 4, I don't know about the Mohawk region. Why are there so many waterfalls called Buttermilk Falls? That's like the most popular name it seems.
It is very generic, and it's like Bald Peak or Bald Bluff for a mountain. And I think it has to do with the fact that quite often organic compounds are kind of turned into suds at the base of the waterfall. So you see a lot of suds down there, and it looks like buttermilk been churned. And it's but you did some research on that, and how many are there in New York
On
State?
the topographic software, it names, they're big enough to be named. At least there were 7 buttermilk falls in New York State, but there are many more than 7
Oh yeah,
in New York
I was looking at
State.
the index. Each book had like
And-
3. One
And
had
of course,
4. So.
we don't, at the time they were named, I guess that would have been in the 19th century probably, people I think paid more attention to buttermilk.
Okay, they must have.
We don't, I mean,
People today, they don't know what buttermilk is.
we buy it to use it to make pancakes, and outside of that, I'm not sure.
Okay, now we're moving on. That's for the waterfall guides. This book, another very interesting book, is called Trails with Tales, History Hikes through the Capital Region, Saratoga, the Berkshires, Catskills, and Hudson Valley. And why don't you tell us, what is a history hike?
Well, this, if I can back up a little bit, this we actually did have what we call our eureka moment, and what led us to write history hikes. We were hiking near Griffin Falls and Auger Falls, which is up near in the Speculator area. And we were really looking for waterfalls, but while we were there, we found it was early fall, and you could see pieces of machinery, but deep in the woods. On a walking, exploring in the woods, and we saw just odd shaped vats, and we had no idea what could have been there. And so we on our way back, and this is the library connection, we were going back to our house on Great Sacandaga Lake by way through Northville. We stopped at the Northville Library thinking, well, maybe there's something about this. And not only did we find out that there was a tannery in that area, but the woods had totally reclaimed this town. But at one time in the 1860s, there was a town, a hotel, a boarding house, a post office, a school, all now gone.
So it was the whole town, not just a building.
It wasn't just a building.
Okay.
And that was, I think, our eureka moment. And from that, it was hard to find information about it, but we were interested enough to write it up and to think about Griffin and what this was like. And we found from there the idea grew to go to these places, and we realized we often walk past, and you probably have too when you're in the woods. Maybe it's only an old stone wall, or it's something dilapidated, a piece of machinery, and don't you say to yourself something like, oh, I wonder what used to be here. And especially if it's in the middle of the woods, where there's nothing. I mean, you think, well, how did they ever, why did they do this?
Well, your book really gives a sense of, if you read the different hikes that are in here, and how many are in this one? About
30.
There's
30.
30.
It really gives a sense that the history or the past is like everywhere. I mean, just if
Yeah,
you're out
but
there. And
it is. But with that book, it was interesting because we wanted to do something I think is unusual, that we wanted to not only, we wanted to find places that people would like to go because of the natural beauty if nothing happened there. But we also wanted them not to be all kind of the same type of things. So some of them, you'll note, feature ponds, some of them glacial erratics, some of them mountains, some waterfalls. And we thought we wanted it to be very varied in the natural beauty. But then on top of that, we wanted to pick places that were not only naturally beautiful, but also something
So connection
happened
with-
that would be interesting. Sometimes it's something famous, you know, like Olana, I mean, and other times it's something that isn't so famous, like Ice Glen, say, and Laurel Mountain over in the Berkshires. So, but they always have something we think people would say, boy, that's really
well, I noticed in
interesting.
here, yes, these aren't just little hikes. I mean, some of these are in nature preserves, battlefields, state parks, cemeteries, ponds, famous houses, lighthouses. There's a couple on islands. You have some are along old canal towpaths, and of course waterfalls. But
Of course.
so then
Always
these are all
there.
somehow connected with you know, that area in the history.
And those are the ones that made the cut. Let me say,
so-
we have many misadventures.
Okay.
There are things that are never going to be in any book because we get the idea it might be a good thing, and we can go miles into the woods or down a stream and find, guess what? It can't be written up. It's not worth writing up. Or we couldn't write it up because, say, we find a lot of it's on private land and we
Okay.
wouldn't write it up.
But all of these are within 70 miles of capital
yeah.
of our area. And
Of-
we do have the
yeah.
Berkshires in here, and you know, you write in here, every walk and every trail. I mean, I get the sense every walk, every trail is it's like a story of some kind. Which
Yeah.
story kept coming? It wasn't just you know, out taking a walk.
It's-
There's stories that are
Yeah.
in the air.
What,
maybe,
what we tried to do was literally to take people on a walk with us and then explain to them on this walk what they're seeing around them. In a way, and we love museums. It's like taking somebody through a museum, except in a museum, all the objects are brought in there. And I'll tell you this, from our days in caving, you'll see these speleothems look absolutely gorgeous in caves, like stalactites
Yeah.
and stalagmites. But those old-time people would take those objects out of the cave, put them in museums, and they looked absolutely sterile. They looked lifeless. They lost all their luster. So in our book, we're attempting to bring people along with us in the Natural Museum of Nature and expose them to ruins and all these fascinating things.
Yeah, well, each hike in here, I'll just tell the people watching, each hike has a description of the place, the highlights, what to look for, and if it's an easy walk. Most of them seem like they're not really too difficult. One that was
Yes.
very interesting, I think it's an 8-hike series. The Hudson River School, is that your name, the Art Trail, or is that?
Yes, the art trail
You
is
guys
in
came
there.
up with that? So tell us about that one, because I know people are interested in that.
Well, they probably would be interested in it. We did, really, we were asked to do that. We'd done parts of it, and Cedar Grove and Olana were interested in actually having people go to places where the Hudson River School painters would have painted. And so we described some of these places in the book. Interestingly, after we wrote the book and after we wrote that piece in the book and we did a walk once for Cedar Grove, but we were hired privately last summer by a Manhattan art school to take the students out. And I will say that was great fun. So these students from New York City were and they were all accomplished painters. We had no idea who we were going to encounter when we met up with this group, but they had their sketch pads and they were looking to kind of do a new vision of painting in the Hudson Valley, but they went with us to Artist Rock and to Alligator Rock, and you know, we took them out.
Well, are a lot of
using that book.
Are a lot of the famous Hudson River School scenes, are they still pretty much on display?
You mean, are
Well-
they pristine?
Yeah, well, I know they're probably not pristine, but are they still pretty much like they were when they?
Yeah, you can go up to Artist Rock, which is a really not such a, what is about 3 miles, 4 miles round trip. Very, not a long hike. And you can look down at North-South Lake, which would be, well, in the North-South Lake campground in the Catskills. And you can look down and really see that same scene that was painted by both. In that case, I think Cropsey painted it. I know Thomas Cole painted it. Asher Durand painted it. I mean, I didn't bone up for this, but,
But, you know, and,
but a lot
and
of
the irony is that it's actually more pristine today than it was at the time they were doing these paintings, because from Artist Rock looking down, you would see the Catskill Mountain House, which was this fabulous hotel, lavish hotel. And that no longer exists. And at Catskill Falls, at that time, the Laurel House was up there, right at the brink, right at the top of the falls. So,
Right, yeah.
so those things have vanished. So actually, ironically, today things are even in some ways more pristine.
But the art, this isn't all one trip. These are separate trips, aren't they? You couldn't.
Well, yes, you can do.
Are they really close to each other? Or see their
Well,
own different-
depending, but yeah, because of, well, not, it would take, I guess, a better part of a day if you stopped at Catskill Creek, for example. At that point, you'd have to get out, but that would be roadside. Then you could go up, and yeah, you could,
you could
do
go
it
from
in a
site
day.
to site, certainly do it within a day.
Well, closer to home, I'm going to mention 3 in here only because they're sort of closer to Albany. The Anley Pond, right in Colonie, there's a little section. Indian Ladder, there's a very long section on the history of that area, which is interesting. And Cohoes Falls, obviously many people know that, but I did not know Cohoes Falls at one time was #2 to Niagara Falls as in popularity as a
Yeah.
It absolutely,
tourist.
it-
I mean,
it
it's
was
hard to
be-
believe that Cohoes would be.
Well,
Who
it
knew?
is. I mean, Cohoes Falls, it's 70 feet high and 600 feet wide. And what made it so attractive was its accessibility. You know, the Hudson Valley and the Hudson River was the natural corridor into eastern New York State. There wasn't anything quite as easy road-wise to get to Niagara Falls. So you had all these people coming
I
up
mean,
the
the
Hudson.
Mohawk Valley
Yeah,
and the Hudson Valley.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
hopefully you've corrected me. Sometimes, you know, the words come out and the mind is thinking about something
But
else. But I guess what I'm leading up to is that the people in Cohoes at some point obviously made a decision. Were they going to go with tourism? Because they had this cataract house that rested right at the top, overlooking the falls. And so people stayed there, they enjoyed the falls, or should the falls be turned into a commercial enterprise? Well, we know what the fate of Cohoes Falls was. It was heavily industrialized. Even today, water seldom goes over the waterfall during the summer because all of it's being bled off for the New York State Barge Canal and for the power company that's there.
Well, again, like the Waterfall books, the notes in this book, again, are just really impressive. A lot of history in here. You can go back and visit. If you want to read about Cohoes Falls, for example, you can go back and find these books and these articles and all the work you've done. And some have little websites. Oh, well, the other one, is it Peebles Island, or how do you say that, Pebbles?
Peebles.
Peebles Island and Cohoes, there's a chapter on that. So all in all, I mean, very interesting books. You can find your way around. A lot of history if you use the notes. You can tell you guys are writers, not just, you know, putting these things together. Very, very impressive. So before we close, just a quick thing. The library has all these books. People can come in the library and, you know, check them out. But they are available at all the bookstores. And you're working on
Adirondack Trails with Tales.
Trails with Tales, history hikes, only in the Adirondacks.
All Adirondack. We're working on the Empire State Plaza stereograph book, which would be, we haven't talked about that, but we have a hobby with taking stereographic pictures like the old time, in the 19th century, they used the old stereo
Oh, okay.
viewers. You'd
Yeah.
have 2 pictures, but the eye moves
Oh,
to
yeah, yeah,
one
I know.
image, but then makes it 3D.
And this is a book of
Of 3D pictures.
from, again, in our area?
In
to
our area,
Adirondacks?
they wouldn't be old. They would all be kind of down on New York State, because you have all those beautiful old, not old, but I mean the modern, in the sense the
50 years old.
1950s pieces of sculpture, and so we're
Okay.
writing on that.
And we're also working on an explorer's guide to kayaking in the capital region, exploring a lot of the nooks and crannies of rivers and streams.
Well, you guys are busy. I don't know.
Yeah, we,
Well, that's why we're retired.
That's
so
good.
We can do some work.
Well, and you occasionally speak at area
Yeah, we do.
libraries and museums and things like that. So if
And-
people see your name, it's Russell Dunn, Barbara Delaney, and when you have your other books, you have to come back and
Well,
Thank
we'd
you.
love
talk
to.
to us again.
We'd
And
love to.
thanks for being here today.
Thank you so
well,
much.
thank you so much. We enjoyed it. We love your library.
Thanks. Well, my name is Joe Nash, and thanks for watching Meet the Author.